It's one of those little like tucked away like hidden gems, and I love finding these gardens. When we drove up here, I saw one of our guys. This is one of those gardens where there's going to be something fantastic on the other side of the gate. So I'm so happy to be here.
Well, it's great to have y'all here, and looking forward to y'all seeing what the Cornerstone Gardens is all about.
Great. Well, let's just talk to us about how you got this started. What was it? The Cornerstone Gardens is also, a garden with a bit of a mission and a vision.
Well, it is. When I retired from law practice the first time, I'm back in it now a little bit. My wife and I said, what can we do to give back to the Lord other than our church work? And we had a back house behind the old house here called the Carriage House. And we said, we'll bring pastors in for short periods of time for respite and repose. And so I said, well, I'll build a garden in this old green space here that I've had, and we'll let that be a meditation and prayer garden for the pastors. And one thing led to another. We built a British garden, and the public immediately started wanting to come in and see what this green space was, and the rest is history.
Well, you mentioned the public's interaction with the garden. Especially when we're in larger cities, and green space oftentimes can be limited. I know in Atlanta where I live, that is definitely an issue. And so as they discovered this also became a garden for the community.
Yes, it's a private garden open to the public now. You don't have private green spaces in downtown Mobile as in many large cities, and this is one of them. And people just going down Government Street saw it one day, and they said, what is this? And so just out of curiosity, they wandered in, and they come in now all the time.
So you're on just over an acre, and you've got a lot of action packed into a very small space.
We do. The first garden that we'll walk into in just a minute is an informal British garden. And the reason I say informal is that I've got other things other than boxwood and holly, as you normally find in a true British garden. And everything in this British garden, Eric, that blooms is white. So it's a white, informal British garden with other plants other than boxwood and holly. Then in the back of the property is the next largest garden is a Japanese garden. And then there's smaller gardens that contribute to the larger garden.
Great. Well, I can't wait to see it. Let's go take a look.
Let's go see it.
Well, I think there's something so peaceful about formal gardens. There's a structure and an order to them, and there's a way of just putting your mind at rest at ease because there's not the chaotic nature of like a lot of texture and color going on.
Yes.
So I think for a meditation garden, this is a very natural element, and that's what you've designed here.
Eric, the human mind wants order and peace, and that's what we've tried to do in this English garden. The garden is laid out such as you see that it's in quadrants. Plants I've laid out such as the Indian hawthorn and the gardenias and the sasanquas, which make it an informal British garden in my definition, will all come together if you close the quadrants together. So it's ordered in a very special way. And of course, all the plants that bloom from the gate to the koi pond are white. And white has a peace to it.
Absolutely. One thing too that I love white gardens, and one reason why I love white gardens is because some of the most fragrant plants on the planet are white flowering plants.
That's right.
And I think fragrance oftentimes is an underrated aspect of gardening, because it engages that other sense. So we're engaging our ears with this smell and our eyes with this beautiful color and texture, but then introducing fragrance, which, you've got gardenias, you've got jasmine, you've got many, many fragrant plants here, roses.
Yes.
It's just another layer to the garden that, once again, soothes you, puts your mind at rest, and
Yes.
I think really just, like I said, it adds like that third dimension.
We have basically on the property over 175 different species of flowers and trees, and the best I can figure, of course, we have more under propagation, but we have about 7,000 plants in the garden. So it's a nice size, small, I call it, a botanical garden.
I want to talk about the design of the British garden. You've gone well beyond just the traditional, formal boxwoods, and you've introduced, boxwoods and hollies, what we'd expect in a British garden.
Right.
But you've introduced a lot of other, plants that would not typically be incorporated into a traditional formal garden.
Yes. The Natchez, Lagostromia, or crepe myrtle, the Indian hawthorn. We have many Noyuki sasanqua, that's a favorite of mine. We have white loropetalum. Of course, the camellias are all around, have the camellias dispersed throughout.
Wonderful. Well, you did a great job with this beautiful one.
Thank you so much.
Well, some of the most tranquil and peaceful gardens I've ever been in are Japanese gardens. And of course, the thought behind that kind of gardening is creating this sense of tranquility and peace. You know, you've got water features, you've got hardscape, and just even the way that the garden path winds around corners and, you know, opens up into like quiet, almost like private rooms in the garden is all part of the thought that goes behind this garden. So I want you to talk about the design of this Japanese garden.
Be glad to, Eric. This is a small woodlands Japanese garden, and it's made up of a half path. Well, many Japanese gardens are an oval path from start to finish. This is a half path from the torii gate to the lotus pond, and then it comes back with a dry stream bed, or a simulated dry stream bed. We use 4 tons of river rock laid side by side to make that stream bed effect. And the lotus pond in the rear is one of the 3 garden features. Another garden feature is the slate pond that we use with excess slate off the roof of my 1903 house. When Katrina came through, we made a nice fountain out of that. Then we have another interesting fountain called a shishio dashi, which in Japanese is interpreted deer chaser. It's made to make noise to chase the deer away from gardens and other rodents and things. And I'll tell people that I tour through here, Eric, that it's working because I've never seen a deer in here. But it is a very peaceful place. I'll come out in the morning and have meditation study and have my coffee, and it's just and it seems to always be cool in this garden.
Well, it is nicely shaded too, which is important in the southeast.
A lot of live oaks in here, and we've got some old tallow trees and the like.
Let's talk about the plants that you've selected for this garden. Of course, we would expect to find mostly Japanese or Chinese plants here, but what are some of the ones that have worked particularly well for you?
80% of the plants in this garden are Japanese and Chinese, and of course we've got our camellias that we love that come from both places, and they're throughout all of the garden, including the British garden. We have 5 species of Japanese maple trees, which we appreciate, and loquats are in the garden and other things such as that.
Well, I love the juxtaposition of the different colors and textures. You know, and for a Japanese garden, there are a lot of like lively, more variegated plants, purple foliage, you know, like with this, you know, weeping warpetalum here. So, you know, it does have like little peaceful areas to kind of rest and meditate, but then really nice feature plants throughout.
Absolutely, and as you talked about earlier, there are rooms in the garden basically as you make the various turns. Even though it's a very small garden because of the space we have, as you make the various turns, you come into another area that kind of is surprising depending on what you come up on.
Right, and that's great design.
Very good design.
There's hardly a corner in this garden that does not feature a camellia. Of course, there are hundreds of them here, and I'm assuming that is because you come from a long line of camellia devotees. It's in your blood.
Eric, it is. My grandfather, Cliff Harris, bought the Longview Nursery in the early 50s from Oro Rubel. Mr. Rubel was one of the earliest camellia hybridizers in the country. Pop developed, among other flowers, the Queen Elizabeth II when the new queen went on the throne, and the monarchy sent an emissary over to get her plant. And interestingly, I corresponded with the royal gardener about 5 years ago, and the progeny from that plant is still in the royal palace garden. Among others, Walter D. Bellingraf, Pop was a friend of Mr. Bell and named his plant. My dad, Blanding Drinkard, was a longtime camellia man, worked at Longview Nursery as the foreman of the nursery, and so I learned a lot from Mr. Rubel. He named many camellia plants, including the Earl Stanley Gardner of Perry Mason fame. We've got about 225 cultivars on the property, and many of them my either grandfather or dad developed.
Wow. Well, let's not fail to mention there's a Vaughn camellia as well, right?
Vaughn Drinkard, my grandfather named one after me, the grandson that was about 3 years old at the time.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, what a wonderful legacy.
It's a great legacy. Camellias are a great hobby. Most of the camellias have a history Bob Hope is across the way here. Of course, we know the great comedian, and
Right.
every comedian has a namesake. And the reason we graft is to recreate the exact. If we do a Bob Hope cutting, we're going to create the exact Bob Hope camellias. The DNA, just like Eric's is the one and only DNA in the world, Bob Hope is the one and only. So that's the fun of camellias.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very rewarding category of plants. It'd be hard to imagine a southern garden that didn't have a camellia in it.
No.
And they're very long lived, of course, super colorful. And one thing that I've always loved about camellias and why I've always had them in my garden is this wonderful shiny green foliage. So year round, it's a wonderful like show of flowers, but then also it's a great like structural plant for the garden. And of course, they're abundant here. And it's wonderful to see.
They're evergreen. They're hard to kill. They're disease resistant for the most part, and they're wonderful queen flowers of the year.
There are so many amazing cultivars that exist in the world of horticulture, and I think it's important to talk about what a cultivar is, just in brief. A cultivar is a clonal copy of that plant that we love. So if in your garden you find a seedling camellia that has all the attributes that you want to propagate it by taking a stem from that plant
Yes.
and either vegetatively propagating it by a cutting, so we could take this cutting, dip it in a rooting hormone, put it into a potting soil, put it into a greenhouse, and then perhaps it would form adventitious roots. Well, now this plant is going to be clonally identical to its parent.
Correct.
Or we could use air layering. We see that a lot of times with Japanese maples and many other difficult to propagate plants.
Yes.
But of course, grafting is what has dominated the industry for many, many years, especially if you go back 100 years. That was the way it was done. And you've been grafting plants for how many years now?
60 years.
Wow. Okay. So, and that's your method of choice for propagating camellias, and you've been kind enough to offer to show everyone how it's done.
Glad to do it, Eric. This is a Bob Hope. We talked about that earlier. So I'm
Right.
just taking this cutting. Camellia people call it a scion. I am the scion of my dad. This is the scion of Bob Hope. This will be the one and only Bob Hope DNA when it takes in the graft. I use a Sasanqua, which is not a beautiful plant to most people. It's a pretty camellia, but it's an hedgerow basically. But it's root rot resistant, and it's a hardy grower. So that's what I call the mother plant. I've shaved off exposed my wood by angular cut two ways, and I'm exposing the cambium layer or the growth cell layer of the plant. I've done that on my sign of Bob Hope. I'm now going to soak that in some fungicide while I cut my mother plant. And what I'm going to do here, I'm preparing to make a cleft graft, a cleft incision in the mother plant. And what I'm doing now, Eric, is exposing the cambium layer.
Yeah, the cambium is only a few cell layers deep, and so it's that little layer between the phloem and the xylem, and that's actually what translocates the nutrition from the rootstock
That is
to
correct.
the top of the plant.
That is correct. And the cambium layer between the phloem and the xylem is the growth cell
Exactly.
of the plant. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cleft graft now with my knife. I'm going to take the blade of my knife right below the cambium layer, about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to use some growth hormone. Some people don't do this. I've done it for 60 years because my dad did it. And I have about an 80% success ratio, sometimes 85 if I'm
Wow.
lucky. And so I'm still doing the same thing. I've done it for all these
Well, it's not
years. And
broken.
it's not broken, don't fix it. That's my theory. This is just centered hormone you can get in any store, any hardware store on my rootstock. I'm going to line my wood up. I'm going to open it with the blade of my knife. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in angularly so I cross the cambium layer. It used to be when I first started grafting, Dad would put it straight down and try to catch the cambium layer.
Right.
If you put it in an angle, Eric, there's no way you're going to miss the cambium layer, and that's why I put it at an angle.
Right. It just improves the probability that those little 3 or 4 cells deep actually that green on green has to touch.
That is exactly right. And then I bring the end of the cyan out the other end of the cut, and I actually run my finger across it. And see, that has crossed the cambium layer of the cyan with the cambium layer of the mother plant. Now, for added tensile strength, I put a rubber band. Some grafters do not do this. I do it just about every time because my dad did it.
Right.
You'll hear that several times. Even though I'm in a greenhouse, we're going to put this in a little small greenhouse out of this styrofoam 32-inch cup. I'm going to build a base to my greenhouse with wet sand. That does two things. It's a foundation to my greenhouse, and it retains moisture for the plant. Now, one big thing with camellia lovers is identification. As soon as I cut off this cyan from Bob Hope, I wrote Bob Hope under the highest leaf. And then I'm going to, on my greenhouse, put Bob Hope, as I've done here, so I always know exactly what this graft is until it sprouts growth. Under this greenhouse, I tell people to give it about 8 weeks, and the growth is going to come out of that growth bud if it has taken. And then we'll cut a small hole in the top of the greenhouse with a pencil. That growth will go to the sunlight in that hole. As it starts bumping the top of the cup, I'll actually cut that hole out larger and larger, so the top of the cup will eventually be cut out totally. I'm going to cut these leaves a little bit so the growth will be going to the growth bud and not to support the leaves.
Yeah, that limits transpiration or the water loss through the leaves, so you help keep more of that water inside of your cutting.
That is exactly right. Now, to see how I want my son to do the photosynthesis deal on top of the leaves, so I'm going to orient this pot toward the morning sun. So I'm using my Bob Hope signage to show me where those leaves are pointing toward the sun, okay? Some people will go 6 weeks. I say, let it, if it's growing, it's going to still be growing in 8 weeks.
Right.
Give yourself 8 weeks. And all of these pots you see around this greenhouse, I've got about 100 now. I'm waiting 8 weeks.
Yeah, so there's an art and a science to it, but as we can see, it's not super complicated, and just with practice and trial and error, pretty much everyone can learn how to graft their own plants.
Absolutely, it's a great pastime.
Absolutely, great. Many of our viewers, they don't have an acre to plant plants into. What if they only have a brick courtyard or a patio? Small spaces are very common nowadays, and we don't have large estates. And a couple things I noticed here that I think are great solutions for those kind of spaces are, of course, growing in containers. Containers are so good for things well beyond annuals, perennials, and then also raised beds.
My dad really was one of the first ones from Mr. Rubel that did container gardening and container growing of camellias. And the way they did that was a specific kind of soil. It was, as I recall, 3 parts pine bark, 1 part peat, 1 part sand. And of course, a little lime is necessary, and 888 is necessary. And that is the constituency of my pod gardening, my container gardening, and the raised beds. Fertilization of camellias is very important. If you want the blooms that we had this year that just burst out and were lovely, you want to use a 12-6-6 solution, generally 13-6-6, depending on where you buy it. And then you want to do it 1st of April, very soon on us now, and 1st of June, 2 times at least. My dad would do it sometimes one more time, 1st of September. And of course, because my dad did it and was very successful, I do it. Pruning, you prune right after the blooms stop blooming, and you can prune a camellia back almost to half of its size if you want to.
But it just shows you the incredible flexibility of that plant.
Right.
And then, of course, your point, prune them right after they bloom, as they set buds on new wood. So we want to make sure that we don't ruin our next season of flowers.
Right.
Every time I visit a new garden and meet a new gardener friend, I love to pick their brain for their gardening stories. Everyone has you know, a plethora of like really neat gardening stories, or you know, just you know the interesting people that they've met along the way. And of course, I know that you've got probably a million stories, but I want you to leave us with one story that particularly makes you smile.
Eric, one of my favorite stories in Cornerstone Gardens is about this staghorn fern. Several years ago, I had a small staghorn fern, about a foot diameter, and lost it. And I mentioned to a fellow master gardener that I'd lost that staghorn fern. She said, with kind of a wry grin, would you like a new staghorn fern to replace that? I said, sure, thinking I would get one about that size.
Right.
She and her husband drove up in the back of a pickup truck with this huge, at that time, 37-year-old staghorn fern.
Wow.
Now the story is, Carol Dorsey and her husband Bob were given this staghorn fern 39 years ago, and of course, as you know, they're extremely cold sensitive.
Right, right.
And so they would bring this staghorn fern up 2 stories to their unused bathroom on the 2nd story to keep it out of the cold. So here's your new staghorn fern, and it's a great species, one of the best species I've seen of the staghorn fern.
Oh, it's a beautiful specimen. Wow.
Thank you.
Well, we've had so much fun today, and we've also learned so much from you. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us.
It's been a privilege having y'all, Larry.